Good evening, everyone, and welcome to SocialFlight Live. I'm Jeff Simon. We have such a fascinating show for you this evening. Richard McSpadden is here, Senior Vice President of the AOPA Air Safety Institute. We are going to do a look back on 2021, talk about air safety, and of course, Richard's background, fascinating stuff. Before we get started, as always, just a few things. Tonight's broadcast will be recorded. And in addition to that, of course, it's really wonderful to be here at the first show of 2022. We've been through so much. We started SocialFlight Live at the very beginning of the pandemic back in 2020. And if you can believe it, we are approaching our 100th show. We've been doing this every week with a mission of supporting you and General Aviation as a whole, and the idea of bringing our community together during these challenging times with some fascinating and inspirational folks. It's really been a wonderful journey, and I want to also thank tonight's guest, of course, Richard McSpadden, for joining us. His story is wonderful, and the information that he has is just really enlightening about what is happening in our world of general aviation. In addition to that, I want to talk to you. We just concluded our Fly to Win challenge of the last section, where we have given away a Tempest kit with all sorts of really amazing things from Tempest Aero for your aircraft. And we are kicking off the next Fly to Win challenge with a Lightspeed Zulu 3 headset as our giveaway. And so be sure to check out socialflight.com, download the free SocialFlight mobile app for Apple and Android devices. All you need to do is have that app, get out there and fly anywhere that you land. It'll check you in, get you points, and just checking in once during the prize period gets you entered in that drawing to win. And if you happen to do a lot of flying in there, you may get some extra entries if you make it into the top 30 of our leaderboard. So very cool things going on there. And lastly, this is the last week of showing you this promotional thing we have to support SocialFlight. I'll do my best again to race this up and show it here, but it's our 3D Mustang Globe here from SocialFlight. This is so cool, and it is available. All you have to do is send an email to us at info@socialflight.com, and we'll send you a link where you can get information on how to purchase this and support us here at SocialFlight. Again, that's info, I-N-F-O, @socialflight.com. So now, let's get started with our evening with Richard McSpadden. Richard is the Senior Vice President, as I mentioned, of AOPA's Air Safety Institute, where he leads a team of certified flight instructors and content creators that develop and distribute aviation safety material that really helps all of us fly safer. And he does so much more than that in evaluating what's happened over the past year and looking at ways to improve aviation safety for all of us in general aviation. He is a commercial pilot, a CFI, an MEI, multi-engine instructor. He has both land and seaplane ratings in both single and multi-engine. I almost chuckle here because there's too much for me to list. And in addition to all of that, he has a type rating in the Citation 525S single pilot citation type rating. He has logged over 5,000 hours in a variety of civilian and military aircraft, and he currently serves as the industry chair for the General Aviation Joint Steering Committee. So let me bring him on the line right now, and I would like to welcome to the show here on SocialFlight Live, Richard McSpadden. How are you doing, Richard?
Hey, Jeff, I'm doing great. Thanks so much for the invite since you reached out a while ago. I've been so much looking forward to this, and congratulations on the program that you're running and the attendance you're getting. It's hard to reach those kind of numbers, and it's just a testament to you and the kind of material that you're putting together. So bravo.
Thank you. That's very kind of you. We've been really fortunate to bring inspirational folks like yourself here to share with so many people, and it has been a labor of love, to say the least. So I wanted to start with your personal story. You have a fascinating background. And so why don't we, before we get to safety and the history of everything, let me hear about where you've come from, because reading through your resume and ours, there's just too much to list.
Oh, yeah, thanks, Joe. I just, very fortunate is the way that it started and the way it continues. I started flying in college. My dad started flying, and I saw how much fun he was having, and just really enjoyed it and thought, I'd love to do that. And I had had a desire to serve in the military and serve my country. So that just married well. And so I went into the Air Force, flew for the Air Force for right at 20 years. And then
Wow.
after retiring, came out, worked for Hewlett Packard for a while, and then came over to AOPA about 5 or 6 years ago. Throughout that time, even in the military, I flew General Aviation. My brother's a big General Aviation pilot. He's a UPS 747 captain. And my
Really?
dad is the one that started it all. So, and he taught his son to fly. I taught my son to fly. I taught my daughter up to solo through our Super Cub. So, as often happens in general aviation, it gets in the family and then it just spreads, right?
Yeah.
That's
And I,
that's what
I
happened in
love,
our family.
the service that you've done, obviously, to the country. Thank you for that, and for serving in the military. Don't just skip over that. I want to hear a little bit about what was involved in learning how to fly and making that transition over there, because that sounds fascinating, with your time in the Air Force.
It was a great time to be in the Air Force because it was the Reagan buildup, and so the hardware we were flying was pretty impressive. So I flew F-15s, and I had some really good advice from a friend. I had flown GA, so I had some time before I went in the Air Force, and a good friend said, "Hey, there's just no need. They don't care. They're not interested in all the previous. They're going to teach you how to fly like the Air Force flies." So go in there with that mindset, and that turned out to be very good advice. And I now offer that advice on the backside when people come out of the military that, hey, you had a great experience and you learned the way to fly the military does. There's a lot to learn about how GA flies and all the judgment that's required of a general aviation pilot that, quite frankly, gets taken care of for you when you're in the military. So
Hmm.
I did that. I flew F-15s most of my career. Had a career flying King Airs in the Philippines, which was fantastic. I was an instructor over there, and we had a great ambassador, John Negroponte, who just loved the King Air. And we took that King Air everywhere. We landed that thing on coral strips and grass strips, and we flew it in everything from a mess dress to a bathing suit. And it was a fantastic tour. And then I finished my career in the Air Force as the commander and flight leader of the Air Force Thunderbirds, and then retired after that.
Oh my, and so you must be aware, of course, that we had Nicole Malkowski here on the show as well,
I saw that. Yeah,
yes,
yeah.
and she certainly said that the F-15 was, to her, the
Yeah.
most amazing aircraft ever to grace the skies.
You'll find that from, everybody's partial to the plane they fly. But I'll tell you, the F-15, it's undefeated in aerial combat. I think it's like 110 to nothing in terms of its
Wow.
performance. And there's intelligence reports of, back in the Iraq War, some Iraqi pilots preemptively ejecting because they thought they were in range of an F-15 and they just wanted to eject and, try to survive it. So it truly established this concept of air dominance, and those of us who were fortunate enough to fly it just adore it. Yeah, it was a fan is I guess they're still flying. It's just a fantastic combat machine.
Now, you said you were flying general aviation throughout that time, so you didn't kind of have to readjust both in and then back out to GA?
Yeah, still a little bit. I was very fortunate that my brother and my dad had been GA for such a long time, and so I would come back home from flying in the military, and we fly. That's what my brother, my dad, and I do for recreation. And so we would go out flying, and they had a lot of fun making fun of the jet jockey coming home. And I one really fun time, my brother and I were in a Cessna 140, and he's giving me my tail wheel. So back then, I think it was just an endorsement, if I remember right. Or anyway, you didn't there. In fact, I think this was in the days when you didn't need anything. You could just fly a tail wheel. And so, but anyway, I'm flying with my brother, and we're in a Cessna 140, and I push the power up, and the thing just sits there. And I look at my brother with this look in my eyes, and he goes, give it a minute, And so, sure enough, we wander down the runway and get going. So I was just very fortunate to have those two who kept me grounded in, how to fly GA and the perspective of flying in GA and the problems and challenges associated with it.
That's awesome. I know there's a good friend of mine and former neighbor that's an American pilot that I went up flying with recently, or actually not that recently. And I remember it's fascinating to see the differences because I went into the flight thinking like, oh my God, right now I'm performing for someone who's the job it is to do all of this. And I remember coming in to our little airport and coming down, and all of a sudden I look over and he was white as a ghost. And when we landed, I said, "What was going on?" He goes, "I'm normally flaring at like 100 feet here compared to what you were doing." He's like, "It's been a decade since I've ever seen coming into the runway that close before you move the stick."
Yeah, and I tell you what you adjust to is in the military, and I think airline pilots will agree the same way. Everything you do in the military and the airlines is very procedural, and there's ops rules for when you can fly and how strong a crosswind and the weather limitations and what your co-pilot has to be, and it takes away a lot of the judgment of the pilot, which quite frankly makes it safer. That's how they make it safe. And then when you come in, I can remember, in my F-15 being down at the end of the runway having a hydraulic leak, and there's a maintenance technician underneath the airplane counting the number of drops per minute that are leaking from, whatever system. And there was a limitation, 12 drops per minute, you could go. Any more than that, you had to stay. You're in a GA airplane and you see a hydraulic leak, you are now the chief of maintenance, you're the chief of operations, you're the chief finance officer, it's all on your judgment to decide whether or not you can fly and your airplane can fly. And kind of understanding that sort of responsibility as an individual, I think is something that people have to adjust to when they come back into GA flying.
That's interesting, and I think it's something that not only do you have to adjust to, as you mentioned, but it's a good thing for us to kind of talk about a little bit, because part of your mission at the Air Safety Institute is, even with people not coming out of a very formal and structured environment of professional pilot or military pilot, as a general aviation pilot, as you mentioned, you're in charge of everything. You're responsible for the airworthiness of the aircraft. You're responsible for your own airworthiness and for conducting the flight safely. Isn't that the case?
Yeah, it is the case. And now looking at safety data, what we can see, Jeff, is that really that judgment is really where the biggest issue for us is in safety in general aviation. Almost all of our fatal mishaps include some type of decision making by the pilot that is questionable. So understanding that decision making is something that we go hard at in the Air Safety Institute. One of the most popular seminars we give is a seminar that's entitled "Why Do Good Pilots Make Bad Decisions?" And it's trying to break down and understand the human decision making process and how that impacts us in aviation. Our brains are wired to walk around at about 2 knots and 1 G, right? So that's how we process information and make decisions. So they're not wired to be airborne. We're kind of sort of defeating, the nature of things when we're up flying. And so the nuances that causes in our decision making is an important aspect to understand.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Let's start by taking a look at, you sent a couple slides and that really show the data of what's happened in the past. I'd like to kind of cover that and then get into a little more open discussion of what all these factors are and what can affect things, kind of relative to what you've been seeing. Because I'm going to share something now. You mentioned that it's been interesting. There's been some interesting data.
Yeah, so this first slide really tells the story of fiscal year 2021, which was a phenomenal year in general aviation safety. So as you mentioned, I co-chair the General Aviation Joint Steering Committee with an FAA counterpart. And so in that committee, we set a goal to reduce the fatal accident rate by 10% over 10 years. And this, what you see here, the black line is sort of the glide path, if you will, month by month. And in order to make that goal, we've got to stay underneath that glide path. And so the red number is where we are in the given year 2021, month to month. The green number was a comparison to 2020. And what you can see here, and there's other graphs that we looked at in the GAJSC, we had the safest year on record that we've ever had in general aviation safety from a accident rate standpoint by a long shot, by more than 20%. Our
Wow.
fatal accident rate improved in 2021. And what's amazing about that, Jeff, is all of us in the safety world were wringing our hands, in this pandemic, because we were worried about, if you have dormant pilots and dormant airplanes by themselves, that's a safety problem. Together, it's a safety nightmare. And so that's what we had in this pandemic. And then you had the mental aspects and of people losing loved ones and losing jobs, or the things that were going on that cause mental stress that also impacts safety. And yet throughout that, during the pandemic in 2020, we held about steady in the fiscal rate over what we did in 2019. And in 2021, we have the safest year in history. So we're looking at that from the GAJSC perspective to see what did we do? Let's try to figure out. It's always hard to look at the accident that didn't happen. It's right. Always hard to measure that. But we're really trying to take a hard look at, can we figure out why that was such a good year in a year that should have been a pretty difficult year?
And was this data normalized, or was this just ultimate, like total number, like based on the number of flight hours? Or help me understand that.
Yeah, that's why we're very careful to talk about accident rate, because accident rate is normalized for activity. So you're exactly right. You have to be really careful about just looking at raw numbers, because like any kind of activity, as the activity goes up, the mishaps go up. So you want to normalize that over your flight hours so that you can really get a feel for whether or not it feels like you're getting better or not.
And so based on that, and again, I'm going to pull this up one more time just to show this, and then the one right after it. So we had this happening now, and then you also sent me, this is where we are just entering.
Yeah, this is the troubling news. So since September, we've started out fiscal year 2022 underwater. On top of that glide slope, which is not where we want to be. Now, it's early. It's only a couple of months, so I'm not overly concerned about this. But I never like to see us in the red. We'll have to see as activity picks up later in the year whether or not we can normalize and get back underneath the glide slope, which in this case, underneath the glide slope is good. Usually don't want to be under glide slope, but in this case, it's a good thing. Yeah.
So what types of things I mean, obviously you must have spent a lot of time looking at this and trying to understand. I mean, like you mentioned, that the looking at the more recent data is a pretty small sample group compared to looking at that with that full year. And the full year is where all the good news was, of course. So that's a lot of data. You must have been thinking, what's causing this? So what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so the typical, we've had enough data that we look at long enough now to where when we have a good year, we don't typically see a spike or a real drop in one category. We'll see all the categories drop, right? Which is by and large what happens. So what we're looking at still is the primary factor for fatal mishaps is loss of control. Now, that can be really misleading because loss of control is a huge bucket of items. In fact, we're spending some time in the GAJSC trying to break that down in other segments of loss of control. So let me give you an example. If you're in a Cessna 185, for example, and you take off overloaded, well, it's hard to overload a 185 actually, so it's probably a better example. But anyway, if you take off overloaded and you lose control on takeoff and crash, that's considered loss of control. When really, the biggest problem was, overloading your airplane in the first place. If you go up and fly into some ice and you don't have icing equipment on your airplane and you lose control, that's considered loss of control. But that's really completely different than the Cessna on the runway, right? So that's an awful big bucket, and to make sense of it, you have to break it down a little bit. So
interesting.
So loss of control is something that we look at pretty closely. And then next to that and well below it is what we call system component failure power plant, basically an engine failure of some kind. And then we get into VFR into IMC accidents and CFIT, which are pretty close together, and those are the top categories. So the one that really, and then fuel related.
Mm-hmm.
The things that bother me are the VFR into IMC. We're just not making a lot of progress on VFR into IMC accidents. We'll have on average somewhere around 18 a year. You know, and you think a fatal accident and a half every month of people going VFR into IMC, it's just head scratching to me. We've tried so many ways to make progress on that category, and yet still we're not reaching pilots for just how dangerous that situation is. And about a third of those, by the way, have IFR ratings. So,
Really?
yeah. So what we're finding is, the VFR and IMC accidents, if you're IFR rated but not proficient, or if you're IFR rated and in a new equipment, maybe new avionics, or you've upgraded, or you're in somebody else's airplane, those are still problematic areas in terms of, getting yourself in the weather. So we, in the entire safety community, have some work to do. We have to be honest and say we have not made progress in that area like we need to.
I find that fascinating and head scratching, as you mentioned also, because when we look at where the advancements have been in technology for aircraft, they haven't generally been in all these other areas. They've been in the one that should be affecting VFR flight into IMC conditions. They've been about synthetic vision that's happened over the past couple decades now. Introduction. They've been about all these more inexpensive autopilots and auto leveling and bringing the price down on all these different things and electronic flight instruments. Why do you think that those advancements haven't really impacted those numbers?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of reasons. One would be some of those advancements aren't in all of the airplanes yet. There's been a pretty big adoption, but they're not there. If you look at the wide GA fleet, I think the average age of an airplane in General Aviation fleet somewhere around 40 years old, maybe a little bit older. Mm-hmm. So there's a wide variety of airplanes that are out there, and the average GA pilot flies somewhere around 50 hours a year, maybe not even 50 hours a year. So when you take into perspective, that whole group of pilots we're talking about, I think therein lies where this challenge is. And I think that it's tough for pilots to realize how difficult it is to regain your situational awareness, sort of your attitude orientation, once you've lost it and you don't have the training on how to deal with it. If you haven't been trained to deal with it, it's virtually impossible to get it back. And what happens is the pilots keep going a little bit deeper. Next thing you know, they're in the weather. And it doesn't take much to get disoriented if you're not familiar with how to deal with it.
Yeah, that strikes me as I really like that you touched on that training being the key there, because I think even it couples with the technology that's available. I started my avionics career at the corporate level in synthetic vision. It was way back in creating portable synthetic vision systems even. And so even for people without glass panels, there are so many different things you can have even on your iPad that have synthetic vision. And I remember from those early days, everybody involved in that side of creating synthetic vision was thinking this is going to be the end of those types of accidents. That the idea that you can look at a screen and have it look like you're looking outside, that it doesn't require the abstract training of an attitude indicator and a turn coordinator and a heading reference. All of a sudden, it's like, well, that's just not going to happen anymore. But it did, and I think what you're hitting on is even that training is the issue. Even if you have that even if you have something that shows you exactly what it looks like outside, you need to actually go up and have someone put a hood on you and see so that you can survive that.
Yeah, I think you're right. And that analysis that you did and we all did and said, there we go, that's the silver bullet, right? We're going to just eliminate these accidents. we were thinking of that again, sitting here at 0 knots and 1G, looking at a screen going, this is the answer. Well, it's much different when you're up airborne flying at, 100 knots or more, and your body, which you rely on 99% of the time to keep you in balance walking around, like we do, is now telling you that you're leaning right, but your body and your inner ear are wrong. And
Mhm.
and you having to overcome that, which you rely on most of the time, to live your life and not fall over in the street, and now to disregard those feelings and focus on this instrument, that's where the training's involved, and it's very difficult.
That's an excellent point. And I will say, from kind of inside the labs there, from multiple companies that we were working with, that was all done in simulators, and it was really easy to candy code it and have it look so exciting and so wonderful at the time. We did stick VFR pilots with regular instruments in the simulator and with other instruments in the simulator, and show, oh my God, this is amazing technology. It's going to stop all this. But that's what was missing, and I don't think we realized at the time how critical that inner ear, the vestibular changes, like
Mm-hmm.
the experience, how critical that was, and that we couldn't just do that. None of it was going to really solve it if you didn't do the training in the air.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so, but what you mentioned, the technology that's available, that's certainly had an impact for us. I mentioned we had a record-setting year last year by a long shot, but if you look, over time, since about the mid '90s, we've dropped our fatal accident rate by about half.
Hmm.
And how we've done that is, a large part of that is technology, by
Right.
bringing in, can you just imagine the information now available? I know you can imagine it because you use it in ForeFlight. And remember how, before ForeFlight, I have to tell you, when something like ForeFlight came out, and there's Garmin Pro, when ForeFlight first came out though, I scoffed it because of, all it was built up to be. I said, there's no way an app, for whatever it cost at the time, it was ridiculously cheap, can have all that information. And sure enough, it does, and more.
Yep.
But like, that's just one example. Satellite weather. I can't imagine now flying in the mountains without satellite weather.
Mhm.
To go flip on your system, and while you're on the ground, before you take off, see what the weather's doing. It's just amazing that technology has helped us so much in so many ways.
Yeah, and I think it's easy also for us to think about that technology in terms of exactly what's right in front of the pilot of an attitude indicator or a primary display. But as you mentioned, it's weather, it's traffic, but there's also some things I think that came along during that time period that we don't think of as much. You mentioned fuel, obviously being a key
Yeah.
contributor during that time, and the difference over the past 20 years, let's say, of fuel flow monitors and the ability to measure and know more accurately what's happening and be alerted to it, so you don't do foolish things with running out of fuel. That also has had an impact.
Yeah, a positive impact. We still have too many of those in my mind. I want to say, off the top of my head, I want to say it's right around 12 a year, somewhere in there,
Hmm.
maybe a mishap a month due to some kind of fuel mismanagement. And in my mind, that's just still too many.
Hmm.
Um, some of the fuel systems in these older airplanes, I fly a Super Cub and I have the original fuel system, but you just have to understand that, and work with it, and realize the level of accuracy that you're dealing with. And so we still struggle with that in GA more than we should, fuel management.
Have you seen when you saw this reduction over the past year in the accident rate and in the fatal accident rate? Has it been evenly distributed, or is it certain areas and certain types of accidents that really have benefited?
Yeah, pretty evenly distributed. I think weather-related accidents is coming down, and we're happy to see that. Sort of the technology things that you mentioned. But in general, I think it was pretty evenly distributed in terms of, the the reduction in accidents that we
Mhm.
saw.
Interesting. You mentioned pilot attitudes and as one of the things, and decision making being, the such a large contributor to this in some of our discussions. Um, the it seems to, at least from my personal experience, we all have these stories have been there and things that we fortunately learned from and didn't die from. And most of them in my past seem to have come from this learning of empowering the pilot, where you now decide you're going to start making decisions, either not worrying about declaring emergencies or not worrying about other things. You're just going to make decisions to protect yourself. Tell me a little bit about your thoughts on that and on the decision-making process.
Yeah, I agree with you on that, Jeff. In terms, I think first of all, there's been a real improvement in our relationships with the FAA through the years. We're starting to see some signs that trouble me a little bit about that. I hope they're just sort of temporary, or maybe spikes. But this whole compliance philosophy or compliance program that the FAA adopted has made it so much easier to have honest conversations when you're airborne with whether it's ATC controllers or other people, because you don't feel like they're going to come after you and go take your ticket. They're more interested in making sure that you understand what the issue was and comply with it. To me, that's been a tremendous benefit to general aviation safety. And so, kind of to the point you were making, if we can get pilots not to misprioritize when you're airborne and you're in extremis, your only priority now is not following the regulations. It's not worrying about anything but exiting that situation safely, whatever that requires. And so I think that decision-making process, hopefully it would start early so you don't ever get into that situation, but sometimes it happens, and sometimes it's not really your fault as a pilot. You did the best you could, you put forth good judgment, and now here you are kind of in a square corner. So that whole decision-making aspect is fascinating to us, and something we'll keep trying to hammer away at. I don't want to go too long, but there's a point there I want to make, if I can, Jeff, on that whole decision making. What we've learned, if you'll bear with me for a minute, is that the very first decision that you make on an issue as a human, and this really isn't aviation related, this is now just as humans and leaders. I was reading this book called Why Good Leaders Make Bad Decisions, which is how we came up with this seminar idea. And what we learned from that is, once you put in all the effort required to make a hard decision, in our case as a pilot, it's a go, no-go decision. Maybe the weather's marginal, it's right on the edge, it's kind of a buffer, and you make the decision to go. From that point on, you're very reluctant to overrule yourself in that decision. And we see it time and time again in aviation accidents where, because a pilot called a friend or made some comments airborne or whatever, we know that they were right on the bubble trying to decide go, no go. They decide to go, they're airborne and get an update of the weather being worse than what it was when they were on the bubble, and still decide to go in, and it sometimes ends tragically. So what we're trying to make a push for in the Air Safety Institute is be careful of that first decision you make. And then when the data changes, you have to back up and reassess. And don't consider it a failure, because we're pilots, we're kind of type A, and we think if I decided to go there, then if I don't go there, I've failed. And we really have to somehow figure out how to change that mindset.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like fixation that you get on having made a decision and where you're going, and you sort of miss the other options at some point as things start to deteriorate. I mean, again, we've all had our own cases of that we've learned from, and I've experienced that myself. Fortunately, a little early on in my flying career, but both were situations where I thought the consequences would be bad. I mean, there was one coming in flying back from Canada that was a fuel-related one, where all sorts of diversions, all sorts of other things and weather came along the way and started to jeopardize the fuel situation. And all I could think of during that flight was, you've got to actually go where you filed to because of customs. And it wasn't factoring in that my life was worse than whatever the consequences are, or even, are they really that bad? You just get fixated on that.
Yeah, you do. Isn't it interesting how in hindsight it's so easy to see, but in the moment you're misprioritizing items like worried about customs when you should be worried about your life. And
Right.
all of us have been there doing that. And when you land or when you work your way out of it and finally make the good decision, you're like, why was that so hard for me in the moment? But
Yeah.
recognizing that it is maybe the first step for us to begin, is to recognize that it, for whatever reason, until we understand it, it is hard to make that decision in the moment. So make it earlier. Try to make it a
Right.
premeditated decision.
The other thing you mentioned about being this being kind of a collaborative team with air traffic control, et cetera. Um, I think that's another one that again, to personalize it, has bitten me in the past, and I think hits a lot of people where we're all working. You're all working when you're doing a flight, especially in IFR and IMC conditions. You're all working towards the same end, but that doesn't mean that air traffic control has the same information that you do. And you have what you can see out your window, and you also may have better, in some cases, better weather information on board. And it was a really hard lesson for me personally to get to the point where when ATC was steering me towards something bad and really, really wanted to do that because they were only, not because they wanted me in bad weather at all, but because they only had certain pieces of information, and theirs included like what sector they could control, and they didn't see the things I saw. And I didn't feel empowered enough to simply say, I can override that. There's no consequences other than I need to prioritize safety. Do you find that that's also kind of an ongoing issue?
Yeah, I think so. One of the most enjoyable parts of this job for me in ASI is we have a really strong relationship with NATCA and other controllers around the country, FAA and elsewhere. Um, and what I've learned is those controllers want the same thing we do. They're working so many airplanes. All they want to do is get you into their airspace, give you what you want, send you on your way, and keep moving the traffic. And so they're so less interested in violating you in any kind of way. And so that's important to know, is they're not really sitting there with the gotcha going, all right, if he moves one more foot, I got him. They're really not, and they're really there to help. And then the point you make, and this is something we're working with NATCA on. I think NATCA realizes that the controller group today, there's fewer pilots in this controller group than there used to be. And so what you're dealing with sometimes is a controller who may be giving you advice, but doesn't realize that you can't comply with that, or you shouldn't comply with that. And so they're kind of relying on you to be the safeguard to say, I'm sorry, unable. And so I think you're right about that, is recognizing it really is a team effort. And you as the PIC kind of have to help them understand, that you can't comply or shouldn't comply with something.
That's an interesting observation. I didn't know that there were fewer pilot air traffic controllers
Yeah.
now than there used to be in the past.
Yeah, and to their credit, I really admired NATCA. They reached out to us and asked us for help and ideas that we had to help educate their controllers who aren't pilots on some of the things for different airplane types, some of the basics on airspeeds and that kind of thing. And so we're working with them on little kind of cue cards that controllers can keep handy so that they can see what kind of performance capabilities they're dealing with.
That's really, really interesting. I mean, one thing that I definitely have seen a difference over, the few decades I've been flying is I haven't seen as much in ATC, but I have seen a decent amount in flight service. Obviously, there was a major transition that happened when things went from, local flight service stations to a centralized, contract flight service setup. And I know I'm in New England, and here you have, certainly as in many parts of the country, very local, geographically based, things about expectations and expertise that the local flight service used to have. They used to know, like, hey, this is what's predicted for, let's say, the Cape and Islands that can easily get fogged or other things, and they would really guide you through, especially young and inexperienced pilots, when you called for information that I just don't think is possible in this day and age, even though you have so much more accurate information at the moment of what's happening in the cockpit. Do you have any thoughts on that aspect of like learning weather and not getting yourself into those situations ahead of time?
Yeah, you're right about how that flight service used to be valuable in that regard. It was just helpful to have another voice on the other end of the phone that would they would offer you the weather, but then they would also talk to you, if they had time. And
Exactly.
when you were a young pilot learning, you were kind of happy to hear that. Um, and so I think it makes the point that now, since it's also digital, you can get all that information. And you're right, there's more information available to you in more user-friendly format than ever before. And it can also just overwhelm you. And so having somebody you can reach out to, I'm a big fan of the culture piece of general aviation, whether it's a type club. Type clubs are so good for general aviation. And this is one of the reasons that they are, because if you're in a type club and you see that weather, you can call up a friend of yours who's flying the same airplane you're flying and say, here's what I'm thinking and here's what I'm doing. And they'll give you honest advice. And, I'm very fortunate in AOPA. I have my brother who I really admire as a pilot. I have a lot of friends at AOPA, and I don't hesitate to call people and say, hey, here's the weather and here's what I'm flying. Here's what I'm thinking. Does that sound reasonable to you? And they're good enough friends. They'll either say, no, it's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. How did you get your pilot's license? Or they'll say, yeah, it seems fine. So I think having that is so important, to have that network around you.
It sounds like what you're talking about to some degree is mentoring really, and
Yeah,
having those people that you can bounce things, like you mentioned, bounce things off of. And maybe that's what we're really honing in on, because that's when I think about it, that's what I missed. Because as you mentioned, they would read off the weather and then they would kind of be very more expert and more informal. And I remember more than once having a flight service actually tell me, honestly, I wouldn't go because I know it says this, but this is what I think is going to happen. Or
yeah,
if you held tight for a couple hours, even though it says it's not, I'm gonna pretty sure that fog bank's gonna lift. Um, that mentoring seems like an opportunity to
it does.
talk about things and get beyond looking at a METAR and a TAP and really getting some coaching for a flight.
Yeah, I think it does. And again, I just really strongly recommend people join the Type Club for whatever airplane they're in.
Mhm.
Whether it's Super Cub, Type Cub, or whatever, any airplane I've owned. The first thing I will do is, usually before I buy it, is I'll go join the Type Club, because those guys in the Type Club, those people probably know the exact airplane you're looking at. They know who owned it before you, and they can tell you all about that airplane. So yeah, they add that cultural element, that the mentoring piece, that I think you're right. In this digital world, Jeff, I worry a little bit like you that we may be missing that a little
Well, I think my fiance Heidi likes to say everybody needs their board of directors. And you have this, you kind of develop this network of your board of directors. And I think we all need somewhere where we can reach out to bounce things off of before we fly. And some of it may be the flight planning. Other aspects of it, I know I get a lot of calls as being an A&P and an IA, of someone saying, hey, I just got to the airport and this is what I'm seeing from, there's oil dripping out or whatever, or for some reason this
bit.
tire's, low and it hasn't been low before. Whatever it is, it's the same thing. Like, don't launch. Like talk to someone, find out, get someone else's opinion of whether it's nothing, it's fine. You should be encouraging someone to go, or I don't care if you've got, you really need to be there for that graduation, drive.
Yeah, but either way, I find that so much comforting. And I would say most of the time when I do that, I'm very fortunate here at AOPA that we have some A&Ps and IAs around. And if you see something on your airplane, like Carlos is our one around AOPA, just a phenomenal maintenance person and pilot. But you can call Carlo over and say, Carlo, what does that look like? And 70 to 80% of the time, it's good. Let me tell you why. Wipe it off. Here's what you're looking at. This is probably what this is. You're fine. But there is that 20% of the time where he'll say, no, this is not flyable. You got to do something. Either
Mhm.
way, even if if you go flying, he says it's good. You feel so much better instead of sitting in your airplane going, well, I sure hope that wasn't anything. So having that network of people to reach out to is really, really important.
Yeah, every once in a while it also winds up in a better place. I remember thinking back on some other flights with friends that when I've approached with, things I wasn't sure of, every once in a while someone says, I'll tell you what, I think it's got a good out and I'll lower your workload. I'll go with you.
Yeah.
So back on the data and what you're actually seeing, what what do you think, what are your targets going to be? What are the things that you look at right now and feel like there's initiatives, there's things that you can actually do to affect those things that are not really budging or looking like problem areas?
Yeah, so we are launching in 2022 a real focus area of VFR and IMC and the Air Safety Institute. We just want to go after that hard. And in safety, it's very difficult to make immediate impact. You'll have to measure it over time. But we want to bring more awareness to this problem and then see if there's a reason why some of these strategies that we think should have more impact. And I want to be careful. They're having an impact. We think they should have a bigger impact than what we're seeing in terms of improving safety. So at our end of year webinar, we announced that an initiative, a focus area for us in 2022 is VFR and IMC accidents. And the key to safety, by the way, Jeff, if you really want to drive down mishaps in aviation safety, and the reason we've done it, by half or more over the last 25, 30 years, is 5 principles. If you take knowledgeable pilots, you train them well, keep them proficient, put them in reliable equipment, and surround them with a culture that encourages good decision making, you'll improve safety. And those are the 5 keys: is the knowledge, training, proficiency, equipment, and culture. And so to make an impact on safety, you have to hit all 5 of those. You can't focus on one. And
Yeah.
so that's what we'll be trying to do in the VFR and the IMC. What can we do across all 5 of those principles in the coming year to try to make an impact there?
That'll be fascinating to see. I'm really looking forward to seeing some of the things that you guys come out with having to do with that,
Yeah.
because that's, I think, as you mentioned, a lot of this is happening for IFR pilots, and it's hard. It takes a lot to remain proficient as an IFR pilot.
Yeah, it really does. So that's one area. Another area that we're looking at is the just really explosion in adventure kind of flying, or backcountry flying, and that type of flying. That segment is just growing rapidly in general aviation, and it's good for general aviation. We're seeing it bring people into general aviation specifically to do that kind of flying, and they're having a lot of fun, and they're bringing some energy to it, and we're excited about it. We think it's good. The challenge is, especially when you talk about some of the backcountry stuff, these people are coming right from start, getting their license and jumping into some of the most demanding flying that you can do. And so we put together a coalition, really, of individuals and different associations that have a shared interest in us in safety. Now, we may have different perspectives on different things, but we all agree that to make this flying safer and to keep it open to where we can all access it is good for all of us. So that's something we're working really hard on too, is to make sure that ASI is there for the people flying in the backcountry in terms of keeping our eye on whatever we can help in safety for them as well.
Yeah, that's fascinating, because that is the fastest growing kind of like super
Yeah.
exciting part of aviation. And it is interesting how many people are kind of moving quickly into that. Have you already seen issues in that area having to do with safety that kind of warrant a concern, or are you just trying to get ahead of it?
Yeah, we have. It's hard to measure because it's hard to normalize activity levels for backcountry flying, and so it's hard to get anything other than kind of raw numbers in terms of measurement. We really decided to take a hard look at this, and might get my years mixed up. I think it was 2 years ago when we had a fair amount of. I think at the field called Mile High, we had 5 mishaps alone back there. And this, if you looked at them, Mile High is a very demanding strip to go into, and one that really, unless you're going in there to camp or hunt or something, it wouldn't be a place you'd access. And so we thought, part of the challenge is maybe people aren't fully aware of the level of difficulty that they're getting into. And so we're very thankful that we have a lot of people coming together with us to sort of help get that word out. But I think that answers your question. Yet we've seen some concern back there. And our concern is that if we keep having mishaps in some of these fields in these wilderness areas, then we risk those fields being closed down and we risk having access to them.
Right.
And then of course, there's the concern about just safety and saving people's lives and
Right.
airplanes and the rest of it. So yeah, for all those reasons, we're putting a fair amount of effort into just making sure we're there for that piece of GA as it grows.
I love that you're embracing it. I think, general aviation as a whole is often very conservative. When we look at things like Icon aircraft, they came out with this, big kind of adventure attitude, and then of course there was some landmark accidents that happened, and a bit of backlash of like, hey, you can't be promoting this type of flying and low altitude flying or things like that. And now against that backdrop, the world moves on, and now that, as you mentioned, this whole community of finding short airstrips and backcountry camping and hunting and all these things, and going into things that require more skill and are more adventure based, that's happening regardless. And so to embrace it the way that you are, and trying to then go and do what you can to promote safety and help that audience, I think is a really wonderful and commendable thing.
Yeah, I think that's AOPA. If you fly, we are in support of you, right? So we are really an advocacy for anybody that flies in general aviation, from the Learjet crowd or the jet crowd to the backcountry crowd and everybody in between. So I really credit my boss, Mark Baker, for that sort of concept. Is that we embrace people that fly in this environment and we want to protect it. And I also think there's just a shift going. Sometimes that happens, a generational shift or whatever the case is. And for a long time, GA was mostly about going point A to point B and, traveling in style and having a lot of fun doing it. And certainly that's still a dominant part of general aviation. But we're really seeing a growth and a kind of shift in just flying for the sake of flying, just flying for the fun of it, flying out to, either a gravel bar or a sandbar on a river or somewhere in the backcountry, just for the sake of the adventure. And as that shift happens a little bit, we see more of that shifting. There's typically some friction there when you see kind of shifts like that, and just trying to make sure we can help manage that and help everybody see that, hey, we're all in this together and we all need each other to be successful is part of the work we got to do.
Isn't that wonderful? And I think it's kind of the pendulum that swings back and forth. I think if we go back many decades, you get to a point where it was more about just the joy of flight, and then it got more serious and more about justifying it for your business, justifying it for this. You can almost look at the advertisements through the years and through the decades and see that change. And now here we are back to like a whole bunch of different replicas of Cubs and STOL aircraft, and people looking at how they can just go have fun.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's certainly the chapter that I'm in general aviation. I bought a Super Cub not too long ago, and just the sheer delight of the places you can access in a Super Cub and the kind of flying you do. You don't fly a Super Cub to go point A to point B. It'll get you there. You just gotta
have enough time.
That's right. A lot of time.
That's interesting. One area that I've always been passionate about, which kind of couples the aircraft maintenance side with the flying side of things, and may make a connection between regular flying and your general accident graph and this adventure flying. I've always wanted to figure out how can we encourage people to take their own aircraft or the aircraft they rent on a regular basis and see those performance numbers for themselves, experiment in safe environments, where they can go to an airport with a long runway, do the calculations, and see how their plane flies at gross, see how they climb out on a day that's got humidity in addition to temperature, see how different things happen in different situations, so that they're not finding out for the first time when they're pushing a limit. so that they actually know what their plane really, really does instead of just looking at the charts. What kind of thoughts do you have in
Yeah.
that area? Because that seems connected
Oh,
to how you get into those short strips in the backcountry.
yeah, I think that's really, really good insight on your part, Jeff, because time and time again, when we see a mishap, a fatal mishap occur, it's because the pilot had been into that airfield or flown that airplane or that approach many, many times before, but they had not done it in this particular situation with this kind of gross weight scenario or this kind of crosswind or whatever the case is. So understanding how your airplane is going to perform at the limits, I think is really important. In fact, some of the people in this backcountry safety coalition I mentioned have brought that up, that, hey, our issue is that people aren't fully realizing that to fly your airplane slow flight at gross weight and being able to max perform short field, soft field takeoff at max gross weight at high density altitude, those are the factors that are going to cause the issue.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think you're right. I don't know if you are familiar with Ed Wishmeyer's expanded envelope exercises, E3, he calls it. Have
I'm
you ever heard of
not, but you
it?
have
I
my
think,
attention.
yeah, I think at Oshkosh, he was one of the Innovation Award prizers for loss of control that the EAA was running. And he came up with a series of exercises, and I think he's come up with something like 50 of them. I went down and flew a lot of the exercises with him in his RV7. And he gets to the issue that you're talking about, Jeff. He's come up with some exercises that people can do on their own or with an instructor that take you kind of closer to the envelope of your airplane, not on the ragged edge, not dangerous in any sense, but it's closer to that and helping you understand how your airplane's going to perform. And I have to tell you, when I first was exposed to this, I was candid with Ed and said, Ed, I don't get it. It just doesn't seem that impactful to me. And he said, that's because you're not looking at it right. Look at the experience you have in aerobatics and the kind of flying you did. Most people who get their ticket nowadays have not ever stalled in a turn because instructors, it's not required on your check ride and instructors don't do it. I check with some DPEs I know, and they confirmed that. They said, yeah, at least half the students that come in for their pilot's license, their practical test, have never stalled in a turn before. So I think we have some work to do there, and it gets to the point that you're making on that.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and also goes back to what you said about the importance of type clubs and and instructors that come with type clubs. I remember many years ago, I owned a Grumman. I was passionately in love with the aircraft, flew it for a long time, and then went to a fly-in of the type club where I went up with an instructor who knew it like the back of his hand, and he was way high in my opinion, for short final, and he said, "Let me show you how you can get down," and taught me about slipping in. I knew how to slip, but I had no idea. I was so scared of the low end of the speed envelope. I didn't even understand a whole dynamic of how the plane flew, a plane that I actually owned. And having learned that from that point on, it changed a decade of flying for me, of understanding that plane. And the same thing seems to be the case when I've talked to people. I mentioned flying at gross or another time. I've asked other people who have said I've never flown my plane close to gross. Well, that means the first time that they need to take extra passengers or extra something to get back is going to be the first time they're going to experiment with that. And
Yeah.
all of these things, it seems like we can gamify this almost. We can take that fun aspect and say, start experimenting with your plane in a safe way.
Yeah, yeah, I think you're right. So maybe we can figure out ways to encourage people to go do that. Because our experience has been people are looking for reasons to go fly and interesting and fun things to do when they fly. So maybe coming up with some of these kind of exercises. And one of the things we did a couple years ago in the Air Safety Institute is we started developing these focused flight reviews with very specific profiles, like VFR profile, an IFR profile, a backcountry profile, a seaplane profile. And so we've begun advanced maneuvering profile, and we've inserted some of these E3 maneuvers into this focused flight review. They're free, of course. Everything we do is free. It's on our website. And you can download them, and it's like a flight profile to go fly. And it also gives some instructor tips that NAFI and SAFE helped us put together about how instructors can teach these profiles. And we inserted some of Ed Wishmeyer's E3 maneuvers in that profile. So, maybe that'll help some.
Oh, that's great. I love that. And do you have plans also do you push a lot of this into the world of flight instructors? So we're not just getting to the people, but we're trying to change the way people teach?
You're onto something there. Again, Jeff, is the way to really influence the pilot community is get to the instructors.
Mm-hmm.
So we keep a pretty open and routine communication with NAFI and SAFE,
Mm-hmm.
the two leading instructor organizations, and they help us with either focus flight review or any kind of assessment we're doing on whatever it might be. They'll help us with some of the materials that we develop in terms of reviewing it for us. So yeah, I think you're right about that.
I mean, I would love to see, instead of, as a pilot, obviously, we're always looking at like biannual flight reviews and other, and, instrument proficiency checks and things. And I'd love to see it go the other way around, where the instructor's actually sitting there and going, hey, all you guys that own airplanes at this airport, or all you guys that fly regularly and have your ticket, book an hour with me, book 2 hours with me, and we're going to go up and I'm just going to show you all sorts of stuff that we're going to have a blast, and you're going to come back learning so many more things about how you can fly your plane outside of these rote things that you feel like you have to go do every 2 years or something like that. That would be a ton of fun.
Yeah, I'll plug our focus flight reviews. That's exactly what we had in mind when we built those, and we built those with the industry. Like, those profiles. The Seaplane Association helped us with that. NAFI and SAFE helped us with that. We had the REF help us with the backcountry one. So they're built experts through industry. So if you're, for the listeners out there, take a look at them. We think you'll enjoy them.
Absolutely. Well, you guys have so much to offer. We're coming at the end of our hour, but please tell me. So what's the next thing? What's coming now for 2022? And please tell people where to go look for the Air Safety Institute and all the wonderful work that you're doing.
Yeah, thanks for that. Well, the airsafetyinstitute.org is where you can find our material. You can also go to the AOPA website and work your way through to find our stuff. All the stuff that we do is funded through the foundation. So if you're an AOPA member, thank you. We need you to keep GA strong. Our work, though, is not funded through dues. It's funded through.
Looks like we may have lost Richard for a second there, or at least I did. I would just want to thank everyone for joining us here on SocialFlight Live again, and our special focus here on the AOPA Air Safety Institute and everything else that's going on right now. It's just fascinating, and there's wonderful work that Richard's done as part of that. It really is absolutely fantastic. And again, go to AOPA and check out the Air Safety Institute. And as he mentioned, they're not funded by dues. It's a separate foundation. It's really, really wonderful, the work that they're doing. I also want to point out we are back next Tuesday, January 11th at 8 p.m. We have a very special guest coming on. Award-winning actor and pilot Treat Williams will be with us, and that's going to be a lot of fun. Tuesday, January 18th, we're here with Mark and Mike Patey. And then on the 25th, Aspen Avionics CEO John Uzikai will be here telling us his story. He has also been inducted in the Living Legends of Aviation. Fascinating individual. And one last plug to any of you out there, again, just send us an email, info@socialflight.com, if you want to support SocialFlight and check out that 3D Mustang Globe that we have as well. To all of you, thank you so much for joining us here on SocialFlight Live, and I wish you all blue skies.